Society. I see some familiar faces here, but I'll briefly say that the Institute was formed in 2016 by a professor and a rabbi, combining to think about how indigenous, Jewish mysticism and wisdom can offer perhaps unexpected solutions or give some insight into dealing with very complex and cutting edge modern problems. So it's kind of a strange shidduch or marriage, if you will, but it seems to work. You're tuned into our new For Bringing series. We're going to try to do this. Well, we are going to do this once a month, kind of a community space for us to come together, talk about things, listen to some things. And this is our first episode, so if we have any, you'll forgive us for any technical errors or the like. Without further ado, I want to introduce Ariel, who's going to speak for a bit today, and then we'll get into Q&A post haste. But this is Ariel. Raise your hand. Let me know who you are. Yeah, there he is. Ariel Evan Mayse is an assistant professor of religious studies at Stanford University and the senior scholar in residence here at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and Society. He holds a PhD in Jewish studies from Harvard University and rabbinic ordination from Beit Midrash Ariel in Israel. He's the author of Speaking Infinites, God and Language in the Teachings of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, the two-volume A New Hasidism Roots and A New Hasidism Branches with Arthur Green, and the forthcoming Laws of the Spirit, Ritual Mysticism and the Commandments in Early Hasidism. He is currently working on a book about Jewish mysticism and environmental ethics, and another on how Jewish spirituality can help us rethink the purpose, aims, and practice of higher education. So it sounds like he's busy. Ariel, I'll let you speak to or introduce your topic for today and take it from here.
All right. Thanks so much, Michael. It's great to be here and great to be here with you all. The oddest thing about getting spotlighted is that I end up staring at myself, which is a very strange experience. And it, for me, takes away the great teaching that Zoom has brought into the world, which is, in some sense, the message of Hasidism also: hide self-view.
You can move, if you want to see the gallery, you can change it on the top right to gallery view so you can see everybody.
Oh, I'm gonna. Thank you.
Okay, good.
I appreciate that so much. Much better. It's really wonderful to be here today. Each of these episodes, or each one of these gatherings, is going to be run in somewhat of a different way, and that will be up to the speaker. I would like to do this in an interactive format. I have sources that I want to sit with today, and to the degree to which we can not only have a Q&A at the end, but really build into our discussion an attempt to think deeply about issues of the heart together, I will consider this a success. My topic for today is mourning and grief and togetherness and community, and how Jewish sources can help us in times of travail. We are in times that are extremely dire, extremely difficult, and I find myself reading the news with broken heart, speaking to my family in Israel with broken heart, and walking in the streets with a broken heart almost on a daily basis. And in such times, I think not only about what can I look to in the world around me to bring things to a different conclusion. That is to say, not only do I think about activism and the need for action, but I also think about the power of reflection and the need for togetherness in such times. So all of the sources that I've aggregated today, which I'll make available also to you, really speak to this question. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Some of these sources will be perhaps well known to you. Some of them will be perhaps surprising. We're going to look at poetry. We're going to look at Mishnah. We're going to look at rabbinic sources. We're going to look at Hasidic sources. But it's going to take us everything from Joy Harjo, a contemporary American poet, to T.S. Eliot, to Homer, or whoever wrote the Iliad, and back to Yehuda Amichai. That's our roadmap for today. If you have any questions, if you want to say something, either come off mute raise the hand function. I understand this as primarily about being together rather than simply conveying information. So let's do think together. I'm going to read a poem that I thought of on October 8th. As soon as I started to understand the situation, this is the poem that came to mind or came to heart for me. It's by Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo is a Native American poet. She's the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States, if I'm not mistaken. And if she was in France, that would mean that she would have an entire ministry at her disposal. In America, being the Poet Laureate is somewhat nominal, but it also gives her an ability to speak on a public venue to issues of tremendous depth and concern. So she begins by quoting Sandra Cisneros, who is a Chicana author and poetess. I had a beautiful dream. I was dancing with a tree. That's Sandra Cisneros's. Joy continues. Some things on this earth are unspeakable. Genealogy of the broken, a shy wind threading leaves after a massacre, or the smell of coffee and no one there. Some humans say trees are not sentient beings. They do not understand poetry, nor can they hear the singing of trees when they are fed by wind or water music, or hear their cries of anguish when they are broken and bereft. Now I am a woman longing to be a tree, planted in a moist, dark earth between sunrise and sunset. I cannot walk through all realms. I carry a yearning I cannot bear alone in the dark. What shall I do with all this heartache? The deepest rooted dream of a tree is to walk, even just a little ways, from the place next to the doorway to the edge of the river of life, and drink. I have heard trees talking long after the sun has gone down. Imagine what it would be like to dance close together in this land of water and knowledge, to drink deep what is undrinkable. So sit for a minute and let that percolate. It's a poem that begins and ends with tragedy, with tragic images. It begins with the genealogy of the broken, which cannot be spoken. Then several stanzas about how we might give articulation to that heartbreak that feels unarticulatable. And it concludes with trees reflecting on the yearning to drink deep that which is undrinkable. It's a poem in a certain sense about grief. The opening images, which are arresting and heartbreaking in equal measures, remind us of violence. And at the same time, it's a conversation between human beings and trees, or perhaps a human being and a tree. It's not all trees, but rather certain trees. And Harjo reminds us that trees have their own kind of, we might call it a vegetative interiority. While they are not sentient in the classical sense of an animal that can move, those who understand poetry understand that trees whisper with their own kind of power. I recall here Chaim Nachman Bialik's famous description of the poets versus the prose authors. For Bialik, poets are the people who walk across the bridge of the abyss and know how rattly that bridge is and how it could all come tumbling down, whereas prose authors boldly forge ahead as if that bridge is not teetering and tottering. Poets understand that which is fragile. Poets have shouldered the Herculean task of making that which is old new, that which is ordinary magical, and that which is unspeakable spoken. And they alert us to the language of the trees. It's interesting, this is one of the great skills that all of the Jewish mystics are attributed with. Shimon Bar Yochai, Isaac Luria, the Baal Shem Tov, every one of them we are told that they could understand the language of the trees, which, might mean how to read a kind of omen in the trees, but I think what it means is that they are in touch with a kind of vibrating power of the landscape. This kind of yearning that we have to become trees is really deep in the human psyche, which I think has to do both with our evolutionary biology and also with the way that trees can hold us. I'm like an elk. I'm like a mammal. I am a mammal. When I'm scared, I run for the forest. I run for the heart of the trees. I want to hear them. I want them to help me hold it. There's a line that we often come to in my family. The trees can help us hold it all in attention. But we are not trees. Much as we say, Ha'adam hu etz hasadeh, that people are like trees and trees are like people, we're not the same. We have these weird things, toes, that allow us to move upon the earth, and we stride forward. And we, in some sense, are like the photographic negative, the inverse of a tree. We breathe oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. Our sense of grounding is to stay in the same place for what? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Maybe 80, 90 years? And a tree measures time in eons. And a tree yearns for something that we don't have, that we have rather. Movement. The ability to move to the river of light, the river of life, to be able to shift locations. When humans migrate, we get on a plane. When trees migrate, it takes generations, sometimes even longer. And yet trees also have this kind of whispering yearning to dance close together. I'm captivated by the last line, to drink deep what is undrinkable. As the yearning of the trees. If you woke me up in the middle of the night, I tell you that's exactly what trees do. Trees metabolize the things that we cannot. Trees drink water that we cannot. Whether that's the mangroves that can drink salt water, or that's the trees that can call water up from the depths in ways that we scarcely understand, or whether it's the ability of trees to create their own kind of filtration systems in marshlands. Here, I think it's interesting that the tree itself, the trees themselves, wish to drink deep what is undrinkable. It seems that human beings, according to Joy, have a power that trees do not, or at least one that the trees yearn for. So I ask us, what does it mean to drink deep what is undrinkable? And I argue that it means as follows. The environmental philosopher Donna Haraway calls it staying with the trouble. The great poet Adrienne Rich calls it diving into the wreck. The poet Maya Khosla from Sonoma calls it coming to terms with the terminal. It means the ability that humans have to keep our eyes trained upon that which is difficult. It's really, really hard. And in this sense, I think that the ritual and theological life of Judaism offers us a toolbox, not a filtration system that allows us to drink deep what is undrinkable as if it was not brackish with sadness and almost impossible to hold. But I would describe it more as a catchment system, as a vessel that allows us to hold that which we thought could not be held. So hold on to many of these images. They're going to reoccur as we go through. Another thing that I came to when I was reflecting on what has happened and where I find my own self in these moments is I went immediately to the Mishnah in Brachot. The Mishnah in Brachot, which deals with prayer and deals with blessings, deals with other things along the way. And one of them that it deals with, and you'll see why in just a moment, is how we respond to grief and how we don't respond to grief. And the opening Mishnah of the 3rd chapter of Brachot reads as follows. I'll read a little bit in the Hebrew and switch also to the English. Mi shemeto mutal lefanav patur mikriyat shema min hatfilah umin hatfilin. And then different versions of this add also in umikol mitzvot ha'amurot b'Torah. One whose deceased relative lies before them is exempt from the recitation of the Shema, certain paragraphs of the Shema, certain paragraphs of the Hebrew Bible that are woven together, from the Amidah, the classical 18/19 blessings of the rabbinic liturgy, and from Tefillin, a particular way of binding those words upon body and heart. the pallbearers and their replacements and the replacements of their replacements, those in front of the bier, the coffin, and those after the bier. Those who are needed for the bier are exempt from the Shema, and those who are not needed for the bier are obligated. Both these and those are exempt from the Amidah. So again, if I woke you up in the middle of the night and I asked you, what is this Mishnah discussing? What might you say? One whose relative, deceased, lies before them. Think in good rabbinic fashion. Whose deceased relative? What kind of relative is that? Immediate relative or otherwise? Lying before you? Before you in the same room? Before you in the same city? Before you in general and before burial? And why is these three things? Shema, Amidah, and Tefillin? Two of those are verbal. One of them is physical. All of them are in some sense the kind of architectonics of prayer. They're the real heart of the rabbinic liturgy. Why these? And surrounded by death, what more do we have than the art of prayer? Any thoughts?
Could take the order. Hi, by the way. You could take the order as being like of increasing chiddush. Like you start out with Shema, and you would have thought, I don't know if Shema or Amidah is the bigger chiddush, but the biggest chiddush is maybe Tefillin, or maybe, but it kind of also you could read it the opposite way. Is Tefillin would be, I don't know.
I mean, in at least two, if not three of these are biblical commandments. The
Right.
Shema, in a certain sense, feels like, like if you don't have that, what do you have? The Tefillin is, in a certain sense, is like an extension of the Shema. Literally, it's a binding of the Shema upon your body. Amidah, give it or take it. I can understand, especially in the second part of this, why one would be patur from that, exempt from it. But Noah, your point is well taken. Shema, not to do that, that's crazy. So the question is why? I get the order. Fantastic. Why? One of the greatest difficulties of mourning comes right off the bat, and that's this period of time called aninut. Aninut is a period of time in which one is neither a mourner nor alive in the classical sense that one had been before losing someone who they love, to whom they are intimately and closely connected. Aninut is the stage before burial. It's the stage before Shiva, and all the more so before Shloshim, or the months that come after that, depending on who you are. It's a time of reflection. It's a time of contemplation, but it's also a time of you being exempt from many, many classical dimensions of religious life for several reasons. One of them, you need to be focused entirely on the person who has died. You take care of them. In some cases, you literally sit with them. And in some cases, if that's not your job, if that's a job that has been taken by someone else, you're still responsible for myriad small details that require attention. And even if those details are taken, that person is in your presence and they command your attention. Your obligations to those who have departed do not end with their death. I also think that this Mishnah does a beautiful job of articulating concentric circles of grief. Mi shemeto mutal lefanav, whether or not that deceased person is literally in front of them, or whether or not it's a sibling or a spouse or a parent or a child that is far away. The proximity there doesn't matter. That's at least how most people classically understood this. That's the heart. That's the heart of the matter. But those who are bearers of the ark, or bearers of the bier, bearers of the coffin, nos'e amita, they and their replacements and their replacements, replacements and their replacements, 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 right, are all exempt from certain obligations because they too are touched by this tragedy, and they too literally shoulder the burdens of responsibility for taking care of those who have departed. So here the focal point is one of care, connection, thoughtfulness, and at the same time, if you've gone through the experience of Aninut, you understand how destabilizing it is. You have on one hand the death of someone you have loved, and on the other hand, you have lost much of the toolbox of that which allows you to navigate the world. And it's a very complicated time, and it's a time that requires what Harjo would tell us: depth, connection, and learning how to drink deep what is undrinkable. So continue with me as we move forward. I'll leave you to peruse many of these sources on your own, and I want to go to the next source, which is it's a passage from Maimonides. Maimonides is Hilchot Avel, and I'll say a little bit about that in just a minute. Sets into law many of the laws that we know either from Brachot or Moed Katan or other places, and puts them forward in crystal clear Hebrew. So he describes what we would call the ritual grammar of mourning. After the burial, the mourner sits at the head of the company. Everyone sits on the ground. This is kind of the opposite of the way that a lot of us are accustomed to sitting with mourners. The mourner sits on the ground or on a low stool, and everyone else sits in an ordinary stool. But according to the Rambam, everyone sits on the ground. And we're learning this forth from Eov, from Job. But I want to key in on the second, which is Ein Rashayim Ra'in Lomar Davar Ad Sheyiftach Ha'avel Et Piv Tchila. The comforters are not Rasha'in, they're not permitted to say anything until the mourner opens their mouth first. Why? Well, I think one of the things that this is a quote from the Gemara that has been reworked. One of the things that Rambam is reminding us of here is the destructive power of idle chatter in a space that deserves silence. Rambam may also be warning us against justifications, paltry explanations, the kind of not just idle chatter, but uncomfortable speech that many of us are drawn to in moments where it feels like we are forced to drink the undrinkable, or dealt with a situation that requires the unspeakable. It's easier to fill that space with words. But here, rather, we sit on the ground and we sit together. And when the Avel begins to speak, we respond. And then if you continue reading, when the Avel shakes their head, we find the door. It's not about us. It's about those at the center of the concentric circles of grief. One of the things that's so interesting about reading Maimonides' Mishneh Torah is that, to say that Rambam was a mind that came along once in a generation would be the understatement of that generation. Rambam's was the mind that comes along once every 1,000 years or so, and he looks at everything in the rabbinic canon, and not only does he give you the ruling, what he thinks is the correct answer in every case, and not only does he give it to you in crystal clear Hebrew, he looks at the Mishnah and the Gemara and creates an alternative way of ordering the whole thing. And he also assigns names to the different qualities of halacha or the different collections of halacha that often have something very interesting to tell us. So, for example, he invents almost ex nihilo an entire domain of halacha called Sefer Hamad'ah, the book of mind, or both mental and spiritual qualities. That's not something that you can go to the Mishnah to find. That's not something that you can go to the Gemara to find. So rather than allowing the laws of mourning to be primarily in either Moed Katan, which is a section of the Talmud that deals primarily with the intermediate days of festivals and certain dimensions of the festivals themselves, rather than allowing them to stay there, or rather than allowing them to be primarily in the world of brachot, he moves them. And he creates a whole domain called Hilchot Avel, which is not Hilchot Avelut and not Hilchot Avelim, which is how it appears in other codes. It's not the laws of mourning or the laws of mourners. It's Hilchot Avel, the mourner. And one hesitates to be overly dramatic in reading details in the Rambam, but in this case, I think it's not wrong. In his very title, Rambam has reminded us of the loneliness of mourning. That even amid concentric circles of mourning, and even amid often group experience of mourning, there's something very, very isolating and alone about what it means to be a mourner. I think that is even more so if you look actually where Rambam puts Hilchot Avel in the Mishneh Torah. It's not at the front half, it's at the end. It's in a book of the Mishneh Torah that deals with how we A, enact legislation, and B, govern our society. What does Avelut have to do with that? So I have a suspicion, and there are on this call much greater scholars of Maimonides than myself. I have a suspicion that the reason that he puts it there is that Avelut and the confrontation with death is also a confrontation with primordial chaos, with the collapse of what feels like both political and societal and communal frameworks. So it makes sense to put this description there in between the laws of kings and the laws of warfare and the laws of society and the laws of rebellion and the laws of the Beit Din. It makes sense to put it there. Because of our lives, there is nothing destabilizing like mourning. In mourning, we are asked to go into the chaos, to drink that which is undrinkable. In the context of mourning, I also often think about a poem by Zelda Schneerson-Mischkowski. Zelda Schneerson-Mischkowski, who I think is perhaps the greatest poet of the 20th century, certainly the greatest Hebrew poet of the 20th century, isn't that well known in American Jewish circles. She's read in Hebrew in school in Israel as a part of the Hebrew canon, and her poem "Everyone Has a Name," L'chol Ish Shem, is an important part of the Israeli Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers. But people don't always spend time with the other parts of her amazing canon, and you might notice her name, not Mishkovsky, but Schneerson. She was a first cousin of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and we have a couple of letters between them, and they had a very warm and thoughtful relationship. She grew up in Ukraine and moved to Israel at a certain point. She was also the third grade teacher of Amos Oz, who talks in his Sipur Ava V'Choshech, in his book, Story of Love and Darkness. He talks about teacher Zelda. And teacher Zelda is Zelda Schneerson-Mischkowski. She was also the teacher of a whole generation of Israeli poets that ran the gamut from what we would call like ultra-Orthodox poets to someone like Yona Valach, who was someone who was engaged with the tradition with a degree of anger and rebellion that I think at times was very frustrating for Zelda. But she literally tutored an entire generation of people that ran the entire gamut from hyper secular, not in the sense of not knowing anything, but secular in the sense of linked to tradition and trying to disentangle themselves from it, but never being able to say goodbye to it, to ultra-Orthodox poets whose work was never really published for the common sphere. So Zelda writes from the margins of multiple communities. She lived in Geula, and then when it got to be what it was, she moved out of there and lived in Sharei Chesed, but she lived in the boundary in between Sharei Chesed and ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Rehavia at that point, which was very much a secular neighborhood. And if you went to her house, she would give you all the time in the world, and all the time in the world would often involve these people who would come sometimes even to live with her from, again, the entire spectrum of the religious and social world in Israel. Okay, so she has an extraordinary poem called Al Tirchak, Be Not Far, and I'll read it to you here. The consolers come to the outer courtyard and stand by the gate that faces the valley of the shadow of death. With its terror all around, standing by the gate is all they can bear to do. My soul, too, is miles from the eye of the weeper, inevitably. O creator of nights and wind, this terrible weeping is aimed at you. Be not far away. Let not millions of light years stand like a barrier between you and Job. Sometimes I read Zelda's poems and I'm like, wow, okay, mic drop, we're done. Where do you find yourselves in this poem? Here you have many of the images we've been talking about. A griever at the center. Those who are giving consolation come, but where do they come? And like you can feel the temple imagery here. Chatzer hachitzona. It's like they're coming to the Beit HaMikdash, but it's the Beit HaMikdash that is filled with gates Hamavet, or right across the street from the valley of the shadow of death. They want to go in, but they cannot. Right? It almost reminds me of the story that they tell about the Baal Shem Tov, and they also tell it about Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, that he wanted to go into a shul once, and he tried to go in, but he couldn't. And they were like, "What? Why can't you come inside?" And he's like, "No, sorry, the shul is full of your egos. There's no room for me." This is like the opposite of that. They're trying to come in, but they can't. They're overwhelmed by fear, ema, terror, chaos. What can they do? Amida al hasha'ar kol yecholtam. Standing by the gate is all they can do, all they can bear to do. They stand there. It's not that they're forever away. They're close. But there's a vast chasm, what elsewhere Zelda calls Hashoni Hamarhiv, the spectacular difference that separates between them. And Zelda's there, or at least the speaker is there. It's important to know that she lost her husband, not far from this time, someone to whom she was devoted and attached. And all of her poems speak to God and speak to loss and speak to the absence, and they all are interwoven. The absent God, the absent husband, the absent connection, loss and absence are great feelings, great themes filled with feeling that you find in Zelda's work. So here, Gam nafshi b'merchak parsaot mina ani shel haboche gzerahi. My soul too is miles from the eye of the weeper. Kach, so it is decreed. That's inevitably the case. Is that the distance of the yearning soul, the connected soul, the loving soul, which almost disentangles itself from the experience of weeping, of sadness, the impossibility of doing anything related to prayer? Remember going back to that Mishnah of Misha Meto Mutalefanav? What's possible? Tears? Tears of anger, tears of yearning, tears of fear, tears of sadness. And how does Zelda close? With a prayer. Yotzer lelot veruach. You could probably look around in the liturgy a lot and not find that. It's one of my favorite names of God, creator of night and wind. My other favorite name of God is Hanoten Zmirot Balayla, the one who gives song in times of darkness. Yotzer Lelot Veruach, creator of nights and wind. She says this weeping, this sadness is aimed at you. And her next line is not, get away and stop bothering me, but rather, come close. Stand next to me. Don't allow what feels like millionaire shnot or, millions of light years. It feels almost like a very strange image in a poem that is so deeply saturated with the language of antiquity. All of a sudden, she's like talking like Star Trek. Don't allow that infinite chasm, which he again calls the Shoni Hamarhiv elsewhere, that spectacular difference, create a barrier. Don't let it stand like a barrier in between you, God. I think Marcia Falk's translation here is exactly correct. And she just sort of slips it in at the end. Who's the speaker here? Job. Okay, but it's Zelda. But it's Zelda Job. And if you go back to Maimonides, he gives us not the etymology, the etiology, the origin of the practices, where we learn out all the practices of mourning. There's like 2 things that we learn from Abraham. There's like 2 things that we learn from Aaron when his children die. And then the rest of it is all understood through the lens of Job. Look at his proof text. Job, 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 Job. Eov becomes our pattern for loss. And one of the things that's so striking about Eov is if you've ever spent time with it, I remember I spent a whole Tisha B'Av with Eov once, and I ended up not just sad, but also confused. It's a very confusing and difficult book. It's difficult because the Hebrew makes no sense, and it's difficult because the theological answers are so unsatisfying. And I think that's why I love it so much. It's a book that reminds us that theological answers don't get rid of questions. They help us along the quest. And that's one of the great differences between a quest and a question, is that questions have answers and quests continue. Yeah, Jesse.
Speaking of theological questions, Ariel, I'm so moved by this line you read about the soul being miles away from the eye. Min ha'ani. It's such it's thinking about grief almost like a quality of ecstasy, or ecstasy is a quality of grief, like literally ecstatic, being outside of oneself. And so like
ecstasy and dissociation.
this displacement from the ego, which is interesting because I mean we could think about distance from the eye as it could appear in like a Hasidic text. You described it at the start of your lecture as like, what is the goal of Hasidus but to turn off self-view, to be removed from the ego, from the ani. So I'm thinking about like the spiritual seeker is trying to achieve this distance from ego, from the first person pronoun, but the griever is kind of by onus, but she's forced to be there. What does that mean, that similarity?
It's so interesting. Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I mean, Zelda's another poem called Yeshki et E et Etzmi. That's the title of it. There is one who sees myself. It's like some of these poems are really hard to translate even the titles of. There's another one, Ata shotek elai. You silence to me, which works in the Hebrew, but I think Marcia Falk, who's the translator here that I'm using, who I should say her book is called The Spectacular Difference, and she has a collection of poems that were by Zelda that she translated. Many of them she started translating actually when Zelda was still alive. It's a book I literally can't recommend enough. I used it enough that my copy fell apart, and I'm now on my second copy. And Zelda's poetry has this really interesting sort of what annoyingly might be called positionality, or I would just call position of the speaker, is it's it's a world in which the I and the speaker are not always enfolded one within the other. They're not always the same, in which, she writes on the margins of society. She writes on the margin of experience. She writes from the heart of what it means to be a religious person surrounded by um, people who both fully understand her and also don't understand her, even on the deepest of levels, or especially on the deepest of levels. And let's go back to that other, perhaps the most classic image that you alluded to, if not in full, Jesse, of ecstasy as the soul leaving the body and the moth drawn to the flame, in which the mortal hazards of devotion are laid bare. And here the soul yearns and goes, and this is something that she talks about a lot, the yearning of the soul and the ability of the soul to travel that which the body can, to that where, to places that the body cannot, and yet also places, maybe this is the beginning of an answer to your question, the soul can go places that the I cannot. Ha'ani haboche, the ani, where it's still me experiencing my own sadness. And then at the end, like high self view, right? She becomes Job. We become Job when we mourn. Ha'ani haboche is both the self that is not only the soul, but also a stand-in for Job. And despite all the alienation and the sadness and the complexity of this poem, Gam nashi b'merchak parsaot, I find tremendous hope in this image of a spirit that can rise above the bechi and the sadness of the moment. Maybe it's because it goes deeper. Maybe it's because it goes higher. Maybe because it goes farther. It could be spatial. It could be vertical. It can be internal. However we want to spend that image. But the notion of that which is untouchable in its power and untouchable in its resilience and untouchable in its connection is something that at the heart of this poem is a reminder of al-tirhak. Intimacy can be regained, and that life never returns to what it was. And yet we continue on, acknowledging the brokenness of the fabric, and yet we continue on. So let's continue on. I, for many years, have been sitting with the first Mishnah and the first and second Mishnayot in Ta'anit, which is a chapter of the part of the Talmud which deals with what happens when things fall apart. I think about this a lot when it comes to climate issues. And I'll just describe it to you, and you can go through it on your own time. The Mishnah asks, what is the order of fast days, by which it means, what do we do on a fast day? What does this ritual look like? A public fast day, not just Yom Kippur, not just Tisha B'Av, but a fast day that is decreed because of communal tragedy. And so the answer that the Mishnah gives is a striking image, where the Ark of the Torah, with the Torah, is brought out to the city square. Ash is piled upon it, and upon the leader, and upon the vice leader, and upon each and every person. Everyone there gets a small measure of ash. Then at that same time, or right after, someone gets up and offers teachings of reproof. And we fall into an example, or we're pushed into an example of the great moment of communal tshuva in the Hebrew Bible, which is Nineveh, which is the city of non-Jews, who actually gets their act together and transforms their actions and becomes our pattern for communal tshuva. The elder gets up and says, tragedy is an invitation for reflection, not about justification, not about this happens and therefore that happens. It's really about how do we as a community respond to tragedy. And in those moments, we sit and we think and we link our arms together and we open our hearts to one another. And then we pray. An elder experienced in prayer descends before the ark, and this person who has children in an empty house, which could mean children that have grown, which could mean children that use up all that person's material resources, or it could mean that children who are no longer amongst the living. We find interpretations of this Gemara that go in each one of those directions. And this person who has that kind of fullness and richness of experience, and also loss and sadness, is the person that leads us in prayer. When I think about this source, I think about the Anishinaabe indigenous philosopher who teaches at the University of Michigan, Kyle White, who speaks a lot about the difference between epistemologies of crisis, mindsets of crisis, versus mindsets of coordination. And so his argument is that when you get in a fight with someone you love, it's rare that after you're done with that, you're like, wow, I'm so proud of the things that I said. After that, you're usually embarrassed because you've doubled down on thinking that you're right, sometimes even speaking words that you know are wrong. And so Kyle White's point in this essay is that epistemologies of crisis often lead us to double down on the things that we already thought, and that's how we greet changing circumstances or tragedy, whereas an epistemology, a mindset of coordination in which we see ourselves as socially interconnected and interwoven beings, means that when we are faced with difficult circumstances and even tragedy, we emphasize, rather than a zero-sum game or a high-stakes game in which I have to be right, what we do is we sit and we think together, and we use the values of interconnectedness, reciprocity, mutuality, obligation, community, coordination, and that is the response to tragedy. And I think that's in some sense what the Mishnah is reminding us. Go back to the Mishnah of Brachot, where there's that one person sitting in their sadness, and everyone else is exempt from certain things. Here, it's not that. It's a kind of communal response in which, what are you doing? You're literally putting ash on the person sitting next to you, and vice versa. And you're touching their body, and you're out in the public square. It don't get no more public than that. And it don't get more communal than this. And what do? You take accounting, and you think deeply, and you open your heart in prayer. That reminds me of a strange passage that we find in the Talmud, which says that we recite Hallel on every holiday and in times of tragedy. And Rabbi Soloveitchik used to make a big deal about this. He would key in on this, which is that song is linked to redemption, and it's linked to times of exuberance and joy. And song, Hallel even, is one of the ways that we greet sadness. Song and prayer have the ability to open the heart that had become closed, to undo some of the alienation and some of the isolation that come with tragedy. And with all due respect to that stage, which is an important and critical stage, there is also a time that comes after the time for silence, and that is the time for song. Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, a great Hasidic thinker who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, says something similar about the power of song even amid tragedy. And he says, what do when you have no kind of material assistance that you can give to other people? How do we give to one another? How do we receive from one another? In one place, what you have in front of you, who says, what do? We listen to one another. The greatest thing that you can give to someone who is suffering is to listen to that pain, without judgment, without trying to fix it, mentality it, but just to sit there and say, I hear your suffering and I sit with you in it. And that kind of brokenheartedness then goes into you, and you have to metabolize that. Elsewhere, he says that one of the ways that we can work with that, to do what Joy Harjo asks us to do, to drink the undrinkable, is that we drink the undrinkable through the power of song. And part of the power of song is that it is communal. Unlike talking, where we just talk over each other, when we sing together, and we can layer that experience. And the more melody, the merrier. And at the same time, song is not just an intellectual thing. Song is something that literally vibrates the body and transforms us by bringing the sum totality of our somatic selves, our embodied selves, together. And as I bring what I wanted to share with you to a close, I've been thinking a lot about T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets in this context, about the way in which tragedy and also transcendent experiences alike remind us of the foldability of time and the way that things fold together. Time present and time past, says Eliot, are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end which is always present. He then goes into the rose garden in a famous line about the door which we haven't opened, which is a physical rose garden. It's also an imaginal rose garden. And he's led by this flock of birds who take him down, and I'm going to continue here, to look down at the drained pool. An empty pool. Dry the pool, dry concrete, brown edged, and the pool was filled with water out of sunlight. And the lotus rose quietly, quietly, and the surface glittered out of heart of light. And they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed, and the pool was empty. Go, said the bird, for the leaves were full of children. Hidden excitedly, containing laughter. Go, go, said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present. Moments of magnificent transcendence and moments of heartbreaking tragedy remind us that time past is an abstract, time past is an echo, and time future is an abstraction, and they anchor us in the present in ways that are extraordinarily painful and extraordinarily difficult. There's something powerful about the ability of a tree to hold that for us and the ability of a tree to lift us out of that as we climb up into it. It's also true that staring at water has a place in this pool that is filled with light. In Hebrew, we have this. Nehorah is light, Nahara is a river. Lights and rivers come together. And staring at this pool in which it's empty and full at the same time, and we see the time in all of its fullness. And what else do we see? The laughter of children that are birds, that are leaves. But we don't see it through what in Hebrew we'd call an aspecularia sheme'ira. It's not through a shiny speculum, through a shiny glass. We see it in the reflection of the light mirror, which is also built out of the heart of light. I thought about this for a long time, and then I thought about this Gemara for a long time, and it didn't click until recently, where there's this story in the Gemara about Rav who's wandering around. This is the third parak of Ta'anit, where there's all these random stories about random people who pray and then the rain comes. And the prayer leader does this, and it works, and Rav comes up to him and is like, what is your special quality such that when you pray, it just begins to rain? And he says, I'm a school teacher. I teach children. And I teach them without mind to their socioeconomic status. And if someone can't pay, I charge them tuition on a sliding scale. And if they can't pay, I don't take anything. And here's my favorite part. And for the children who struggle, I have a pond with a school of fish. And I win that student over with my fish. I calm him and soothe him until he learns to read. And if we think about children who are struggling, not exactly as mourners, but those who are faced with a world that makes no sense, with a world in which everyone is telling them what to do, in a world in which everyone is shouting at them, and they don't know what to do, and they're trying their hardest. For those who don't fit in the world of formal school, or those who fit in the world of normal society, rather than yelling or rules or kicking them out, what does this person do? He goes and he leads them out and he sits with that person. That's how I'm imagining it. Sitting on the bench, sitting with that person. And what do? They look into the pool and they look together. And some people say it's because he gives them a fish and then they have a nice lunch. And I don't think that's the answer. I think it's that they stare into the pool, which is Elliot's pool, and which the child sees time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present. And it sees the leaves behind it and the children laughing, and comes then to find their way back into the learning. And as a sign of kind of personal coda, thinking about the laughter of children, in times of war, I always go back to thinking about the Iliad, which is like what Anthony Lane said about the movie American Sniper. It's a devastating movie because it's a pro-war movie and an anti-war movie at the same time. The Iliad is a pro-war book and an anti-war book at the exact same time. And Achilles, who is both a character of comedic arrogance and also the star of the show in a certain sense, has a shield, and his shield gets almost an entire book devoted to it. And Achilles's shield is embossed, it's engraved with a series of images. And of those images, one of them has to do with war, and everything else has to do with peace. And it's not about going to war so that you know what you're fighting for. It's about so what you know what happens when you have given things up for war. And his vision of redemption, his vision of a world, is a world in which children are able to be unafraid, in which people can get married, in which fields are harvested. And it's the vision of Zechariah, when Zechariah says, "There shall yet be old men and women in the squares of Jerusalem." The vision of redemption is the miraculous ordinary. The vision of redemption is a world in which people are unafraid, in which laughter once more can ring out in the square. And as Zechariah says elsewhere, not here, when everyone is scoffing at the second temple and they're like, what a terrible small potatoes version of the temple. And he says, Mi baz leyom aktanot. Who are you to scoff at small things? In times of tragedy, in times of travail, I'm comforted by the miraculous quality of small things. So I'm going to hold here.
Thank you, Ariel. Professor, that was pretty great. I was thinking it's not every day we get a private lecture from a Stanford professor. Definitely lived up to what I would imagine, very just mystical and interesting. I have a mundane question, which I can save till later or even some other time, but I wanted to open it up to anybody in our group here. This meeting is, our Farbrengen series is intentionally a meeting, not a webinar, by the way, and never the twain shall meet. So in the meeting, we're all here together. Questions, comments, thoughts, anything anyone wants to say? I know Ariel only has about 2 minutes left because he probably has another lecture. So, but feel free to jump in if anyone has anything.
Ariel, I just want to say thank you so much for bringing together so many different sources. I think that that go past the intellectual and kind of reach deeper in. The poem that you brought by Zelda, I hadn't heard before, and I really loved, and I really appreciated the space and the space that you created for us. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Max.
Ditto. Ariel, when you need to jump, just jump, but go ahead, anybody else?
I just wanted to say, I'm not a Jewish scholar. I'm Michael's mother. I'm here because of that. But I just so appreciated everything you said. I feel like my head is swimming. I feel like I'm absolutely inspired. I feel like I'm going to go back and read some of your poetry and your sources again. I feel honored to have spent this hour with you as an amazing Jewish scholar. And in these times, I think you gave me hope in a very big way. So thank you so much.
That's so kind of you. I'm honored to have spent the time with you.
Well,
right.
I want to, since we're running low on time for Ariel, I wanted to, any questions you have, hold on to them, send them to us. You can reach us through our website, ijss.org. I want to close by saying that I just am finding out that our next Farbrengen will be on December 14th, and we'll have Lior Shmuley, who's a faculty member in the Department of Jewish Thought at Bar-Ilan University, and her work focuses on Kabbalah and Hasidism, with an emphasis on ethics, morality, the meaning of the commandments, the history of emotions, and gender studies. So that's going to be interesting. Stay tuned on our social media and on the website. If you want a copy of this recording of this lecture, reach out to us through the website. And I feel like the conversation could go on, but I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone for now. Thanks for joining us on our first Farbrengen. It was pretty great. And next one, December 14th.
Can't wait, y'all. Take care. And be in touch.
Thanks, Ariel.
Thanks, Ariel.
Yeah.